Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. So I've been doing a series about haunted places in Western Queens, New York, and I'm not really done with that series, but I just want to pause and talk in this episode about Beacon, New York, because I just went on vacation there. And it's a really cool and weird place full of spooky ruins and creepy cemeteries and all sorts of stuff. And I wanted to talk about it while it was still fresh in my mind. So the backstory behind our Beacon trip was last week we were supposed to go to Iceland. We had booked the tickets back when it seemed like COVID was like almost over or something. And just with everything going on, it wasn't the right decision for us to go on vacation abroad. So instead, we decided to do sort of a staycation, and we decided to go to upstate New York to a town called Beacon. So Beacon is one of the few towns I've ever been to in upstate New York. I've only ever been to Beacon. I've been to Beacon twice now, and I've been to Albany once for a day. So when it comes to upstate New York, I'm very ignorant, and I'm sorry if I get anything wrong in my characterization of upstate New York. But my impression of Beacon is that it feels a lot like Brooklyn, just it's a small town in the mountains on the Hudson River in upstate New York. It is rapidly gentrifying. It is very vegan friendly, which is a reason why it was an attractive place for us to visit. There's lots of hiking and stuff you can do there. There's lots of cute shops and a lot of artists live there. But you can kind of tell that it's a place that not that long ago was economically depressed. And it's a place with a lot of history, and it's a former industrial area that got kind of decimated by various factors. So I'll talk some more about the history of Beacon in a sec, but just to talk a little bit about our trip. So we were only in Beacon for 2.5 days, and Atlas Obscura, which is a website that I really like that kind of talks about weird and interesting places you can visit all around the world. Atlas Obscura has a page with things to do in Beacon, and it lists 6 attractions. And out of the 6, I did 5 of them over the course of 2 pretty strenuous days. So I managed to go to 3 hikes to ruins. I went on a boat ride to some ruins. I visited 3 cemeteries, and I tried to visit a 4th, but I couldn't find it. And I also went to, there's a fancy modern art museum there that's in like an old factory space. So I went there too. So I did all of that in 2 days. I was very tired. And on both full days that we were in Beacon, I woke up around 4:30 a.m. so I could go out around sunrise or a little bit before dawn. On day 1, I went to an extremely spooky cemetery, and on day 2, I went to the top of Mount Beacon, where the ruins of an old casino, hotel, and railroad are. And also on top of Mount Beacon, I did a solo Estes session. And Mount Beacon is what I want to focus today's episode on. So, like I said, Beacon's a really popular destination for people from New York City to travel to for like a weekend trip like we did. It's about an 1.5-hour ride on the regular commuter train from Grand Central Terminal in the city. So you don't even have to, book an Amtrak ticket. You can just get on the train and go. It's really easy to get there. It's a very popular destination, like I mentioned. It has a really small town vibe. So I mentioned there were a lot of people who had clearly relocated from New York City. There were also a lot of people who had clearly lived in Beacon for a while. There were a lot of veterans there, and plenty of other folks who seem like they've seen a lot of different sides of Beacon over the years. People were pretty friendly there. It was normal for locals to say hello to me when I was walking around town. Really had that kind of nice small town feel. There was also a fairly sizable population of homeless people there, which I was pretty surprised about. Though maybe I shouldn't have been, since it's been so rapidly gentrifying. And it is expensive to live there. For reference, I looked in the windows of a real estate office there. They had stuff posted about how much it costs to live there, just out of curiosity. And one bedrooms cost more than they do in my area of Queens, at least. And I saw one bedroom apartments that cost as much as our two bedroom here in Queens. So potentially you could live in New York City for less than you could live in Beacon. Maybe that was just a fluke. I do think that a lot of people have left the city and moved upstate. So I'm sure prices have gone up a lot there over the last year. I noticed that houses there they start around at $500,000 to buy. So it is, an expensive place to live. And that probably explains why there's a lot of homeless people there. So that's my impression of Beacon now. Cute place, little pricey. Let's get into Beacon's history. So we know that back in the 1600s and prior to that, the Wappinger tribe lived on the land where Beacon is now. The land was purchased from them by fur traders from New York City in the 1680s, but I'll give my usual land deal caveat here. I don't know the details of this purchase, but many of the deals that colonizers did with indigenous people here were very suspect at the best, and I suspect that's probably the case here. Before Beacon existed, there were actually two towns called Matawan and Fishkill Landing, and later on, the two towns were incorporated in 1913 into a single town called Beacon. And the name Beacon comes from the beacon fires that patriots lit on top of Mount Beacon during the Revolutionary War. So it does have this Revolutionary War history. Historically, Beacon had a lot of mills and factories, which of course are all shut down or ruins or torn down, etc. now. But early on, flour mills were a really big thing there. During the Revolutionary War, arms were manufactured in Beacon. In the early 19th century, hat production became huge there. And Beacon, or, the place that's now Beacon, was known as the hat-making capital of the US, though I believe that it was technically the number 2 hat-making town in the US. I think a town in Connecticut had the number 1 spot. But at any rate, lots of hats were made there, and at one point, there were 50 different hat companies in the area, all making hats. And I actually visited the ruins of an old hat mill, which is now right near some really nice hiking trails, and one of the trails leads to the ruins of an old brick factory, which is out on a peninsula called Dennings Point. So brick manufacturing was also big in the area, in part because they could build the factories near the water, and then boats could pull up, load up the bricks, and then carry their cargo down the Hudson to New York City, where they always needed more bricks for building all these new buildings that were always and are always coming up in New York. Though, of course, Beacon does not make bricks anymore. But for a long time, the brick factories of Beacon were supplying building materials for New York City. Makes sense. There was also plenty of tourism in the area back in the day. Atop Mount Beacon at different times, there was a hotel called the Beacon Crest, because, it was on top of Mount Beacon. There was a casino, there was a restaurant, and there was an incline railway to take people up the mountain. People could take the train or a boat from the city or elsewhere, then take a trolley to the mountain, and then they could take the train, or, the incline railway, up the mountain. Nowadays, if you want to go to the top of the mountain, you have to walk, 45 minutes or so from the station, and then you have to hike up the very steep mountain yourself. It's not a long hike, but it is steep. There was also a ski area nearby, which closed in the 1970s. The Incline Railway that I mentioned opened in 1902, and it was designed by the Otis Elevator Company. It was half a mile long, it rose more than 1,500 feet, and it had an average grade of 64%, which made it the steepest railroad in existence at the time. The Beacon Crest Hotel could hold 100 guests, and the casino wasn't actually for gambling, but it had a balcony that ran all the way around it and had beautiful views. It had a rooftop observatory so you could look at the stars through telescopes, and it also had a really powerful searchlight. It sounds like it was just a place to hang out and have fun. An article published last year in a local paper, the Times Herald Record, describes the top of the mountain and what it looked like back then. So I wanted to read from that. The top of Mount Beacon was laid out like a park with fountains, walkways, and summer houses. A large casino and hotel, in place by 1926, a roof observatory which housed powerful telescopes and one of the largest searchlights manufactured to light up the Hudson River at night. The 75-mile panoramic views from the summit and its natural setting would be the lures to get tourists. So the most popular time for the destinations atop Mount Beacon was the 1920s. However, on October 16th, 1927, a fire destroyed the Beacon Crest Hotel and the casino, and the powerhouse for the railroad was luckily spared, and the casino was rebuilt in 1928, so, people could still get up there, and pretty quickly after that, there was at least a casino for people to hang out at. However, before the hotel could be rebuilt, the Great Depression hit, and that totally stopped progress on the hotel. So the tourism trade was, it was hit hard by the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it was hit hard by the war in the 1940s. And according to the Mount Beacon Incline Railroad Historical Society, as more and more people got cars after, in the 40s and 50s, etc., tourist attractions took a hit. The idea here is that when people relied on trains and trolleys, they ended up getting funneled into major tourist attractions. So, there would be these big attractions and everyone would go there because those were the places you could get to. And once people had cars, these popular destinations started to decline. I had never read that before, but it makes logical sense to me. Though I'm really bummed that that's the case since I do not have a car and I do not drive. So I love it when a tourist attraction is connected to a train or a boat or something that I can get to. So cars had an effect on tourism. And also, meanwhile, in the 1930s, there started to be a number of fires that broke out on the railroad. So that destroyed parts of the track, and that kind of kept happening throughout the 20th century. Sounds like maintenance was also getting more expensive, and the railroad was sold in the 1960s. And while there had been plans to redevelop it, those plans fell through. And as the railway got older and more decrepit, fewer and fewer people wanted to take it, etc., etc. It's kind of like a vicious cycle. So when a fire broke out in 1967, the lower power station for the railroad, as well as one of the two railway cars, was destroyed. So that was a major blow. Also in the 1930s, the railway, which had more and more sporadic service, finally closed. They parked the two cars in the middle of the track, halfway up the mountain, hoping to avoid vandalism on either side. And as the Historical Society put it, they awaited better times. In 1982, the railway and the powerhouse were put on the National Register of Historic Places, which was a promising development. However, unfortunately, in September 1983, a huge forest fire broke out, and it destroyed every part of the railway. The fire was suspicious, and it was probably the work of vandals. Today, if you hike around the area, you can see these bent, twisted parts of the track. You can see these snapped and frayed heavy metal cords. And you can see the very picturesque ruins of the powerhouse at the top of the mountain. This story of Mount Beacon reminds me a bit of the tales of Coney Island in Brooklyn. There was, this cool vacation destination that included some cutting-edge technology and really, exciting sights, but it was destroyed by a fire and allowed to decay, which is, just sad. I was trying to put my finger on why this made me sad. I always complain about development and that sort of thing because in New York City, developers are evil and kind of ruining everything about the city and have been at that for quite a long time. But I was trying to decide what about these, leisure areas being destroyed made me sad. And I think that part of it is just that you think about like families going places for years and there's all these happy memories there, and then it's just gone. So it's this place that once held a lot of like joy that then is quiet. And I think the other part too is there's maybe this existential dread that I feel, even though like now it's this beautiful hiking path and there's nothing wrong with it being a beautiful hiking path. But I think I just feel this dread because we're taught to expect that like human history is always going forward. There's always more things being built. Things aren't being destroyed, they're being created, etc. And that's not a good thing. It's gotten us into a lot of problems with the world and the environment, etc. But I think that's just so ingrained in me that when I think about something that was somewhere that's now gone, it like automatically makes me sad. And it feels like haunted to me. Like not even in like a spooky ghost haunted way, but like it's almost as if like my imagination of what happy memories might have been there, what it might have been like, I like can't separate that from what I'm actually seeing. I don't know. I'm really curious what other people think of ruins and whether they feel this way too. Like I guess in my day-to-day life, most of the ruins that I see, the ruins I go to most often are the Renwick Smallpox Hospital ruins, which I go to very often. And you don't get the same feeling when you look at the ruins of an old hospital. Like I do feel sad because it was architecturally a beautiful hospital, but I don't feel that same sense of, I guess the word for it is hauntology, like this feeling of lost futures. That feels like the most accurate word for what I feel when I look at the ruins of something that maybe once was once positive and that I'm sad doesn't exist anymore. So anyway, I know that was a long digression about my feelings about ruins, but I'm definitely curious what other people think about it as well. So anyway, that's the history of the spot, of the top of Mount Beacon where I went. And I went to Mount Beacon the first time in December 2016. It was in between Christmas and New Year's. So I went for a second time last week in August 2021, where it was extremely hot and humid and sticky. So I woke up really early, like I mentioned. I reached the peak at 7 something a.m. It was an extremely foggy day, and the mountaintop was actually in the clouds, and mist was literally swirling around the paths. It was also extremely hot and humid. I struggled a lot during the hike because it was literally hard for me to breathe the air. I consider myself in pretty good shape for hiking. Like I spent a lot of last year hiking in North Carolina on the weekends, and it's very humid in North Carolina, though I really think New York weather is worse. And yeah, I was basically hiking in a cloud. And so the reason why I got up so early was because I wanted to be alone and to have the mountaintop all to myself to try out a solo Estes session. I saw very few other people there, and even on my way down, after spending 45 minutes or no, maybe even an hour and a half up on the peak, I still didn't see that many people. So my strategy of getting up really early and getting there early during terrible weather worked. So when I got to the top of the mountain, I walked around the summit. I looked at the ruins of the Incline Railway station, or the railway powerhouse, which are very cool looking. I posted some pictures on Instagram if you want to take a look. I'll try to remember to post some in the show notes as well at buriedsequelspodcast.com. And while I was walking around the summit, I found a little trail leading down the main part of the casino and hotel ruins, and that little trail led to a bunch of boulders going down the side of the mountain. And so I climbed down a bit until I got to a somewhat flat boulder that I could sit or lie down on. It definitely wasn't totally flat. Like I tried to set up a camera on a tripod or even tried to set my GoPro down on it, and I couldn't get anything flat to balance on the rock because it was so inclined down. So that was where I decided was a good spot for an Estes session. And the view from the top of the mountain in general was totally obscured by the clouds and fog. Usually you can see the Hudson River, the city of Beacon, the city across the Hudson, which I think is Newburgh. You can usually see very far, but you pretty much couldn't see anything at all. It was just all white fog and clouds. But from where I was sitting for the Estes session, you could see a tiny sliver of the other peak of the mountain because it has two mountaintops. And that was basically just all trees as far as I could see. So it was very pretty, and it made it feel like I was much further away from civilization than I actually was. I was like a mile and a half or less away from a residential neighborhood. And when I play the Estes session audio, you'll hear trains, like train sounds, city sounds. I think there's you can hear some motorcycles and stuff throughout the entire session. The trains are really loud in that area. So I wasn't really that far away from anything. It just looked like it visually. So as I set up my stuff, I heard something chewing really loudly in the trees below me. I don't know what it was. It was very weird to hear a chewing sound. I don't know if it was like a deer or something, but it was really loud. It was almost like smacking its lips, not quite, but almost. Almost sounded like a person eating celery or something. It was very loud. It freaked me out a little bit because as I was sitting there, I remembered that bears were a thing. And then I was like, I don't think it's a bear, probably. So I don't know if it was a deer or a bird or something else. I'm not very good at animal identification, to be honest. But I think that it stopped when I started my session. I think me talking scared it off a little bit, which makes sense because I couldn't hear it at all in the recording. Also, there were tons of bugs on all of the hikes that I went on in Beacon, and I had originally forgotten bug spray, so I had to buy some on my first day there. So as I was getting ready for my session, I unpacked my stuff. I put on even more of my DEET-free essential oil bug spray, which worked pretty well. And then, because there were still so many bugs, I started spraying bug spray on the rock around me until I realized that maybe I was being too high maintenance, and so I stopped. But you can hear some bugs on the recording. And I should pause here and talk a little bit about what the Estes method is and what I mean when I talk about doing a solo Estes session. If you've listened to the Salem episodes, I talk about it in detail there, and my friend Jen and I talk about a Estes session we did in a haunted hotel in Salem, so you can get a lot more information in that episode as well. But just the really top line SparkNotes version is that the Estes session was developed several years ago. It's somewhat recent. I want to say it's from 2016 or newer. I think it was probably popularized by the show Hellier, though it was invented by some of the folks who were on the web series Spirits of the Stanley, about the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, which is what inspired The Shining. So you should definitely watch that web series if you're interested in it. It's a great web series. Really interesting. And the idea is that one person is wearing noise blocking headphones, not noise canceling, but just drummer headphones that block a lot of noise without adding any noise. And that is plugged into a spirit box, typically an SB7 spirit box. And that's basically a modified radio that you can set to sweep forward or backwards through stations, radio stations. And as it does that, you hear the static, and then you hear kind of snippets of people talking on these different stations. And traditionally, the person who is the receiver, who has the headphones on, also has a face mask on, a sleep mask, to act as a blindfold. And between them not being able to see anything and not being able to hear anything, that allows the other person, I think they usually say the operator or the sender. It allows the person who is asking questions to ask questions knowing that the person who is plugged into the spirit box can't read their lips and can't hear the questions. So the person asking the questions listens to what the person who's plugged into the spirit box is saying, and the person who's plugged in the spirit box is just saying whatever they hear. It might seem totally random, and it might be totally random. But there's also the possibility that someone, something, some entity could be using the spirit box to communicate with the receiver and answer the questions that are being asked. So where Estes sessions become really interesting is when there seems to be a conversation going on. Like if you're asking a question that the person who is the receiver can't hear, can't see you talking, etc., and if they start saying something that makes sense, then that's, probability wise kind of unlikely, and it starts to be a piece of evidence that you could use to say, okay, maybe we're communicating with something, maybe we're learning things. In Salem, we had a really interesting conversation with what we believe was a couple different entities, but in the end, we thought we were speaking to someone who was the ghost of a squid fisherman, and that was really interesting. I will say, in Salem, my wife was the receiver, and she is very sensitive and very intuitive, and I think the combination of her being the receiver and being in such a haunted location gave us like really cool results, I guess. I definitely don't expect regular sessions just out and about at less famously haunted places to necessarily be as interesting. But the Salem trip was last March, and between last March and a couple weeks ago, I had not attempted the Estes method again. And the reason for that is COVID. Most of the time when I go places, I'm alone. The Estes method does not work when you're alone because you need to have like the operator and the receiver. So I know I'm not the only person who's been thinking about how to do solo Estes sessions. I know there's a couple of videos on YouTube of people trying things out. All last year I was like, okay, can I put it on note cards? Can I like write the questions and shuffle them up, etc.? And I finally decided, like, no, that's just too hard. I'd have to hold up each note card to a camera. It just felt too involved to me. And if you are interested in seeing someone do that, if you go on YouTube and search for Small Town Secrets, which is a podcast and also a YouTube channel, you can see someone attempt that style of a solo Estes method. I had no idea this video existed until a couple days ago when I was researching to see if other people have tried the solo Estes method, but that video was posted about a year ago. And what I ended up realizing about a month ago was there's maybe an easier way to do it than writing it down on note cards. What if I recorded a large number of questions, put that on shuffle, and then that was basically like the operator and I was the receiver. So I've pre-recorded about 130 questions. I guess some of those are like several minutes of silence, so let's call it like 120 questions, all of which have pauses of varying lengths built into the end of the track. So basically like there's a question and then a minute or several minutes of silence afterwards. They're each on their own track, and like I said, there's also tracks of different lengths of silence in between them. I wrote down all these questions in an Excel spreadsheet. I used an Excel formula to randomly assign each track a unique number, so that's the only way to identify it once I load it onto my phone. And I just have all the tracks on the music player on my phone. I, gave them an album title of like Solo Estes Method Kit, so that way I can just shuffle that album. And they play at random, and I set the recorder down next to my phone so it can pick up the questions as well as the answers that I get. Meanwhile, I've put on my Vic Firth headphones, I've plugged into the spirit box, and I do the Estes session as usual, as if another person is asking the questions, but really it's just recordings of me asking random questions. Of course, there's a lot of drawbacks to doing the method this way, which I'll go into when I want to do a whole episode talking about the solo Estes method and what I have found works and doesn't work. I just need to spend a couple more months noodling with it. Like I've done about 3 sessions in the last week, trying different things out. I've had varying degrees of interesting answers, which, when I do an episode about this, I'll go into a lot of detail. But to go back to how I've been doing the solo Estes session. So I have the headphones on. I can't hear the questions. In a traditional Estes session, the receiver would wear an eye mask to block their vision. But I don't think that that is safe when you're in public and when you're alone. So I did not do that and will not do that. However, there were no lips for me to read. Not that I can read lips anyway. And if for some reason I saw the track name on my phone, all I would see was a random number. So there's no way for me to know what question's being asked, or even if it's a question or just like 3 minutes of silence, because, I put some of those in there too. And, there's so many questions that it's not like I'm going to guess which of the 120 questions that I recorded is being played. And I have more questions I want to record on my spreadsheet. I just haven't had a chance to do that recording because it takes a surprisingly long time to record and export these files. But this is how I've been doing it. It's working pretty well so far. I am excited to continue doing it. And then there's one more caveat here that is important when talking about me doing an Estes session, solo, being the receiver. If you've listened to the episode I did on the Hawthorne Hotel, you will have noticed that I alluded to having some hearing problems. I have some auditory processing issues, which means that I often have trouble distinguishing words from noise. Like a lot of the time I can hear a word and I think it's either X or Y. Or I might hear the wrong thing initially and then understand it a few seconds later. So it means that at loud bars and restaurants, I can't follow conversations at all. And I can't read lips, so I just have no idea what's going on in any kind of loud setting. And even in regular conversation, often someone will say something, I can't understand what they say. I'll start to ask them to repeat themselves, and usually, often, by the time I'm done asking them to repeat themselves, I can understand what they said. Like, it just takes a little while for me to process it. And a lot of my verbal understanding comes from context clues. And the whole point of an Estes session is that you have no context clues. And also, I don't take notes while I'm in the session because I don't want to sway myself by like looking at the notes and like hearing something to make a complete sentence or whatever. I try every time I hear something in the session to just say what I hear and not think about it in relation to the words that came before or that are going to come after, because I just don't want to sway the results. So this auditory processing issue presents some interesting challenges in an Estes session. Many times during the session, I might hear voices, but I can't tell what they're saying at all. And in those cases, I say nothing. At other times, I heard something, and then I said what I thought I heard, and then, after saying it, I realized it might have been something else. Like I said, typically in a regular conversation, when I hear something that could be 2 different things, I use context clues to decide which thing I just heard. Often, my second understanding of what someone said was the correct one, though not always. But, that's just kind of like my brain has had the time to catch up to what was actually said. So, in the session, when I hear 2 possibilities, I say them both. And on listening to the audio later on, I allowed both as possible answers. Like, if I was like, okay, it's either this or this, I just tried to think a little bit about what would make the most sense in context, because that's how I would operate in a regular conversational setting. I know this is all a little weird, but I'm not neurotypical, so welcome to my world. I'm sure a neurotypical person with no auditory or sensory processing issues would have an easier time doing this, but I'm still really pleased with myself and happy with the results I've been getting doing this method. I feel like it's, for me, opened up new possibilities for me doing solo investigations, like being able to do a solo Estes session. And like one important thing too is I don't believe that an Estes session is about hearing exactly what's being said, like whatever some radio host is saying on some AM radio station as the spirit box is cycling through. I think it's really about what you hear, because it's about a spirit or entity potentially talking to you and communicating something to you. So there's kind of a psychic element at work there. So to me, it's not kind of like the source material of like what's actually being transmitted on the airwaves. It's about like what I, in my brain, am perceiving, because that's the thing that something supernatural may be acting on. So to me, I don't really think it's that big of a deal that I have these auditory processing issues and I'm doing these sessions. But in the interest of full disclosure, I wanted to make sure to explain all of that. And then also just, you'll hear in the session audio that I post, or that I put after this, you'll hear me say like, oh, it's either this or this. And that's not me trying to like game the Estes method and be like, okay, I have these two options and I'll just choose whichever one works the best. That's not what I'm trying to do. This is just how I move through the world. I can't hear anything, right? So that's something. And I will say, one interesting thing is that during the session on Mount Beacon, there was a moment where I thought I heard either augment or mountain. And I said that I wasn't sure which one it was. And then there was a clarification, and the spirit box said mountain again. And the reason why I find that so interesting is, like, one, I kind of like the idea that, you know, whoever was communicating with me was trying to give me a break and help me out. But also, it made me think of the Estes session that we did in Salem. And there was a moment where my wife very clearly said, when I listened back to the recording, it was clear to me, she very clearly said news pool, if I'm remembering right. And I heard lose cool. And so I said, oh, are you losing your cool? And then immediately I get a response that was just no. And so I don't know, I just like these moments of awareness and like potential interaction with potentially an entity that is like aware of my limitations and trying to communicate with me. It could also just totally be coincidence, you know? I think with any kind of paranormal investigation, there's a certain amount that you kind of have to decide if you believe or not. And it's totally fine if you just feel like this is nonsense. But I thought this was really interesting this session. That's how I did it. If you have been doing solo Estes sessions, or if you know anyone who has been, please let me know. I would love to talk to people about what's working for them, what isn't working for them. Just anyone who's attempting this, I would love to talk to. And then I'm going to put the audio at the end of this episode, the audio from the session. But I have a couple notes in that audio before we get to it. So first, like I mentioned, you can hear a lot of train noise in here because Beacon has a train station, which is very far below the mountain. And, you know, the train line runs along the Hudson. It's really only a few miles away from the mountain. If you hear any clicking noises, like I tried to cut most of them out, but if you hear any clicking noises, that's me adjusting the spirit box, like turning it up, turning it down, adjusting the sweep rate, etc. If you hear a mechanical whirring noise, that's just my camera, which is like a little bit loud. I know I took a couple pictures during the session. You might also hear my phone vibrate once or twice because I forgot to put it into do not disturb mode. And for the audio that I'm going to put in this episode, I cut out the long silences, but I didn't delete any questions or answers or reorder anything. However, by cutting out the silences between answers, I brought the length of the session down from 28 minutes long to 13 minutes long. So that means there was about 15 minutes of silence. So there were a lot of moments where I was just kind of sitting on this rock surrounded by flies thinking, am I going to hear anything? Also, the questions are pretty quiet. I guess the volume on my phone was a little quieter than I maybe would like it to have been. So I'll plan to put a transcript of the session on my website, buriedsecretspodcast.com. And then here's kind of my commentary on the session, so you get that before you listen to it. So first, there was a question that came up that was, do you have a message for me? And I got back, you're under Beacon, or maybe you're under again. And I think it meant you're under Beacon as in under the peak of Mount Beacon, though it also could have been referring to being under as in being in the Estes session. Like a lot of the answers, this one started feeling on track in the very beginning. And then as I heard more kind of like words after the question, it started to veer off and make less and less sense. I just found that with a lot of the sessions, answers. Like at first I was like, oh, that's, when I was listening back to the audio, I was like, this is a pretty sensible answer. And then it would keep going and it would kind of start to sound like gibberish. So I don't know if this was just like an unfocused entity or several different entities, or, if I just wasn't getting much. Also worth noting, you can't really hear the second question when you listen to this session, but it's, where do you work? I don't really think I got much of an answer to that. Also worth noting, I forgot to do the sort of like table setting before the session. I forgot to like address whatever spirits I might be speaking to, etc. So you'll hear me do that in kind of the middle of the session. And after I did that, I felt like I started to get more answers, like more often. Because in the beginning of the session, there would just be long moments of silence. Like I couldn't even hear anything. Like maybe there would be some static, there would be some moments of silence. It was very strange. So one interesting question that came up as well was, did you ever live through a pandemic? That came up on Shuffle, and I thought this answer was interesting. I got the answer, many happening, yeah. And I couldn't tell if it was someone talking about past pandemics and having lived through them, or for some reason, I can't get this interpretation out of my head, but I almost wonder if it was a hint at the future and more pandemics. That might just be me being morbid. I don't know why I keep interpreting it that way every time I read this answer. It could be talking about the past. When the question, do you want to hurt anyone, came up, I got a few interesting responses. So one response was morning temperature, which is very funny to me because it was so hot. I almost got the sense that this entity was joking around with me because I was like drenched in sweat. It was really, really hot and humid. Then it said, I do, which would have been slightly chilling to me, as a response to, do you want to hurt anyone? But the vibe during the whole session was extremely positive. I don't feel like that's ominous at all. And then a bit later, it said, I don't kick, which was just funny to me as an answer to, do you want to hurt anyone? There was one question which was, if you once lived, did you die from illness? One interesting answer that I got was, there's no coffin. And then I heard, yeah, and standard. Like a lot of people used to die from illness. I don't know if it's kind of saying like, oh yeah, it's a standard way to die, or if it's just a random word that came up and means nothing. See what you think. The question, how many of us are there, came up. You can't really hear the question in the audio, but that's what that was. And then I got a really clear initial answer, which is, you are only one. Then a few responses later, I got, and then I lead, which was just kind of interesting. Then I got the very funny, I won it, your hat. And I wasn't wearing my hat, but my baseball cap was attached to my backpack, which was sitting right next to me. And I just loved the idea of like this entity on a mountaintop being like, hey, can I have your hat? And one of the problems with doing a solo Estes session is none of it makes sense until you get home and listen to it all, so I couldn't offer this entity my hat. The question, do you ever feel trapped, confused, or lost, came up. And while the question was playing, I got the answer, hey. And then I got find me, which seems pretty relevant. And then air down, follow, maybe ow. And I remember as I got those answers, I was sitting on the side of the mountain looking down, and just something about like air down, follow. It almost felt like a logical progression from find me, like find me somewhere, in this valley you're looking down into, whatever. I think my favorite answer that I got during the session though was to the question, how many entities are speaking to me right now? I pretty quickly got the answer, hive mind. And while that's being said, you can really faintly hear flies or some kind of bug buzzing in the background, and then it intensifies a bit over the next few responses. Then the question, are you lost, came up, and part of the response I got was, no, fuck that. And then it almost seemed to be having a conversation, because then it said, is it the same? I know. And then I got schadenfreude, which I can never pronounce right, but it's the German word for feeling pleasure at someone else's pain. Then it said home phone. And during the session, when I said the words home phone, all I could think of was ET phone home, which to me tied in to the idea of being lost. And I almost have, listening back to it, I almost had this sense that like were there multiple entities and maybe one felt lost and the other didn't, and the non-lost one was kind of rudely gloating about the other one's pain? I don't know. I just like have this mocking image of someone like teasing someone and being kind of like, oh, ET phone home, you think you're lost, whatever. And that's probably just me projecting my own meaning on this, but I can't get that impression out of my head, so it felt worth mentioning. Then I got Check This Out, Wild, and You're Gonna Miss Me. So those are some of the highlights of the session, which I will play now, and you can listen to it and see what you think. It is Saturday, August 21st at 8:31 a.m. I am currently on the side of the summit of Mount Beacon. You can hear the train in the distance. You might be able to hear some sort of animal eating in the woods near me. I'm a little ways down from the summit. I had to climb down some rocks to get here. There is really low cloud cover, but the city's, well, not the city, the trees of the neighboring peak are starting to emerge, and you're starting to be able to see them through the clouds, so it's very pretty. And I'm about to do an Estes session. I think I'm ready to start. It's just solo, and it will be pre-recorded questions on shuffle on my phone. And if you hear me freak out, it's probably from a bug or a critter, though I am plastered with bug spray. All right, putting on my headphones, ready to begin. Do you have a message for me? You're under? Again. Or beacon. I think it said beacon. And well, looking at. Got totally silent. Keeps going quiet. They are. Hoagie, bereft. Do you ever have dreams in which you die? It just got really quiet again. I'm going to try it out of the headphone rather than the spout. And I guess I should clarify that I'm trying to communicate with any spirits or entities who are nearby in a spirit of friendliness and respect. You are my, or oh my. Did you ever live through or witness a pandemic? What was that like? Many. Happening. Yeah. Do you wish I would try to communicate with you another way? If so, how? In your. Is there anything that you want to tell me? I. And. Or am. I. Or high. Valiant. Or valley. And or Annie. Is there something you think I should do? Or that you want me to do? Do you usually go here, I want to say, or something like that? Looking back. 10 in the morning. I just changed the sweep rate to 150 to see what that does. Crowd. Frozen. You. I. Augment. Mountain. Something like that. Then I think I heard mountain again. Near me. The Empire. Where were you born? What or I?
I crash or trash or craft. It. More to come, or motorcycle, maybe. Eats or Keats. How you doing?
What is your location?
How are you? Ready? I need or wanted work. You. That's it. No.
How do you feel at this moment?
Ha. A laugh. It's short. Hey. Austin. Yeah, or Yates. Federal Hall or alcohol? Check that. Just snake or think.
If you are dead, how did you die? And who was responsible for your death?
Whole. It's just weekends. Out back all day. Just that. Monster. Choice down, baby. Yo.
Do you have a favorite possession?
That hurt. Casualty. Where? Something like water or at water.
What do you think of me?
It's here. Or Jen's here. Cruel. Or Cruel Lake. Out. It's just, or at dusk. 300. Hi. What?
If you were once human, what was your occupation?
Lie. I know. So. Or someone. Who? Effort.
Do you want to hurt anyone?
Morning. Temperature. I do. There's no keep. I heard a name, David. But someone was whispering it. Everyone, moment. Enjoy or join us. End up. Every. I don't kick anyone.
If you once lived, did you die from illness?
And no one. There's no conference, or there's no coffin, or there's no coffee. Yeah. Standard. Flank. Further. Full Mac. Trio or freedom.
How many of us
You need this. You are only one. You missed it, hurt. And then a leaf, or I lead. I want it. Your hat. I'm not wearing a hat, by the way, but I do have one with me.
Do you ever feel trapped or confused
Hey.
or lost?
Find me. Air. Down. Follow. Maybe. Ow. Tractful. Power night. Driftwood or stretch goal. Uncle. I know.
How many entities are speaking to me right now?
Hive mind. No. I need a break. Beacon. The amount. And I. Vulgar. Apple. You get.
Are you lost?
Out. Timing, whispered. No. Fuck that. Is it the same? I know. Schadenfreude? Home. Phone. Check this out. Wild. You're gonna miss me.
Why are you
Why?
here?
Or choir. Alright, I think this is enough for now. It's wrong. Thank you to anyone who may have been talking to me. I'm turning off the spirit box now. I don't know if I got anything in that session, to be honest. But I guess I won't know till I get home and listen to it. But I had a lot of trouble hearing things. Like, at first, I couldn't really, like, there were long silences and stuff. And then I switched from being plugged into the spout to the headphone jack. I changed the sweep to, like, 150. And I said the thing about, like, oh, if anybody wants to communicate, then please do, etc. And then I started to hear more words. But I'm, like, kind of hot and tired and hungry. And I'm tired of balancing on the side of a mountaintop, so I think I'm gonna call it a day or a morning, because it's still only 8:57 right now. And it's gonna be a little bit of an uncomfortable climb back up this side of a hill to get up, so just gonna take a couple quick notes in my notebook.
All right, so that was the session that I got on top of Mount Beacon. If you have thoughts or if you hear anything that I don't hear or kind of make connections I don't hear, I would love to hear what you think at either buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com or I'm on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. I am always interested in other people's interpretation. And, since I'm a solo podcaster and I did this investigation solo, I haven't had anyone else listen to it, so I don't really have feedback from other folks about what they think. Do you think that it's nothing and I just got a random assortment of words? Do you feel like maybe there was some intelligence behind some of the answers? To me, I feel like it wasn't super active, it wasn't super dramatic, but there were like these little moments and like glimmers where I'm like, I feel that I'm communicating with someone. When I listened back to the audio, there were moments that felt like they made sense and potentially meant something and maybe were animated by some sort of intelligence. But I'm really curious to hear what other people think. And as often happens, I was originally just going to do one single episode about Beacon, but my notes were much longer than a single episode's worth of notes, and this episode's much longer than the episodes usually are. So I'm going to do another episode about Beacon and kind of some of the spooky places I went. There's a cemetery that was very creepy. There's some really cool ruins that I saw. And I also want to talk a little bit about the stories of ghosts that I was able to find online about Beacon. There wasn't a ton. It doesn't feel like it's a place that has a super big amount of activity that people encounter. But like I said, the whole place is permeated by this feeling of hauntology. Like it feels just a little bit off, a little bit unsettling. I really like it there. It's fun and interesting. So stay tuned for more Beacon stuff the week after next. If you liked this podcast, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review whatever podcatcher you use. That will help other people find the podcast. And thanks so much for listening.